Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we are doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I am here on Gubbi Gubbi country, and I am here with Rachel Gallagher in the studio, who is not in Gubbi Gubbi country. Where are you, Rachel?
I'm on Niagara land, actually, this afternoon on the inner south of Brisbane.
I know you, Rachel, because you posted some amazing things on LinkedIn, and I became #1 fan of Rachel Gallagher, and I was clicking, and anything you said, I was like, wow, amazing. You were doing your PhD and you were discovering all these things about planning, and I became very curious about planning and transport and the impact of the car. I'd started to learn about garages, the amount of land that was just taken up by the car. I became very curious about this and maybe what the difference was before the car and after the car. And you had posted up some very interesting ideas about the size of land. So I just thought I'd get you on the show to talk about your PhD. We'll just take it as it comes. How would you like to introduce yourself?
My name's Rachel. I started my working life actually as a planning and environment lawyer. I've always liked history and geography at school. So I noticed you had a podcast with Caboolture State High School students. Those kids out there that like humanities and like social sciences, you can make a career out of it. I didn't know that at the time. So when I first left school and went to university, I did law and I did a science degree majoring in geographical sciences. My career has moved into planning and urban policy. I've worked at the state government level and not-for-profit. I've really started to merge those two interests of geography and history. In that geographical science degree, as a component of that is a thing called GIS. They're software programs. They create maps. So all those maps that you would see in a planning scheme, or your local government might put out a map of your local government area, generally they're created in a GIS software. Part of my PhD was whether zoning, which is a key tool that planners use to plan the growth and change of our cities. So zoning is the color-coded map that you might see. If you look on your local government website, you'll see a color-coded map that has a variety of different zones, and those zones will tell you what you can and can't do on that particular parcel of land. So zoning is a post-World War II car-centric design system. Prior to the introduction of zoning, we had land use ordinances, and prior to that we had nothing. This is on a long scale. The planning schemes that we know today are really a product of the suburbanization that occurred after World War II. Zoning started as a method of excluding uses, telling people that this is not appropriate in this area. Residential areas were for places for people to live. Excluding industry was one of the things that the zoning did. Industry is not suitable for this location. But as we fast forward over time, by the 1980s, we're starting to question whether these zones are actually creating good settlement patterns, because we've had this kind of sprawling settlement in Australia for a very long time. And so by the 1980s, local governments are introducing what's called mixed use zones or higher density zones, saying that you can have a mix of uses here, not just one use, not just residential or not just industry, not just commercial. You can have a mix of things. It's kind of seeking to replicate the kind of cities that were formed before the car. Inner city areas, if you go to West End in Brisbane, that was an area that was laid out before the car was introduced. Those streets are a bit narrower where they haven't been resumed and extended, where some of them have. So if you go to European cities, Asian cities, you'll find that they look very different to our cities because they were designed or they were laid out when walking was the main form of transport. So these mixed use zones that we introduced in the 1980s sought to replicate those kind of vibrant, dense urban environments. I wanted to see whether those zones worked. Do they work in catalyzing new development, the kind of development that we've got these aspirational planning schemes that have really, lovely words, like vibrant, dense. Do those changes in zoning actually facilitate that kind of new development? So I picked 6 study areas in Brisbane, one in West End, one in Newstead, one in Wollongabba, Nunda, Indooroopilly and Upper Mount Gravatt, so all in the Brisbane City Council local government area. area. And all of those areas have been zoned for higher density, so apartments of various sizes, for at least 20 years. And I wanted to see whether they had changed. The answer was no, that zoning hadn't catalysed the kind of change that the planning schemes had, and that different study areas actually densified at different rates. So interestingly, I found that Wollongabba and Upper Mount Gravatt actually had the lowest rates of densification when compared to the other study areas, the lowest rates of change. Causation or correlation, but both of those areas have the same highway that runs through them. So Wollongabba was severed by the Southeast Freeway in the 1970s. Houses were removed, kind of the street network that used to exist there was also removed, and the highway was planted on top, whereas Upper Mount Gravatt was built around the highway. So the highway was already there when Upper Mount Gravatt was constructed. Again, causation or correlation, I can posit that it was because of the highway that these areas are less suitable for density, even though you might be, as the crow flies, you might be close to the busway station, but if you've got a massive piece of highway infrastructure that separates you from the railway station or the busway, you're more likely to just jump in your car.
Certainly zoning is a hot topic. Density is a hot topic. There is an idea that if you have density, then you get better public transport, better walkable kind of places. Is that true?
So for example, our railway system in Southeast Queensland doesn't pay for itself. The government heavily subsidises it. And you could argue that part of that is because of a low density. Places like Tokyo, obviously they've got much higher residential density, population density when compared to places like Brisbane or Southeast Queensland more broadly. So you do have private companies building these railway infrastructure because they can make money off it. It's not the case here. Our population density is very low. It makes these projects quite expensive to deliver. They're still important and it is a service. And I think we need to remember that not all services or public services do make money, but when you are planning for infrastructure, you can also plan for density. So this is a little side project I did when I was on maternity leave, and anyone who has had a baby will know that you spend a lot of time walking. I walked up and down the streets of West End, Maruka and Upper Mount Gravatt, an inner city suburb, a middle ring suburb and an outer, or it used to be an outer suburb. When it was first built, it was a peripheral suburb. It was a car-centric suburb from the outset. All three of those, I just looked at one block of each, one block in West End, one block in Maruka and one block in Upper Mount Gravatt, and I tracked changes over time. So all three of these blocks zoned for higher density. In West End, that's in the 1890s. In Maruka, that's in the interwar period in between World War I and World War II. In Upper Mount Gravatt, which were largely built in the 1960s and 1970s, most houses experienced very little change. West End, the houses mostly had some modifications. Verandas had been enclosed in the 1960s, often because of that post-World War II housing crisis, where some of these houses had 13 people living in them, and they enclosed their verandas for sleep outs and for more places for people to sleep. And a lot of those verandas have now been reinstated. Where people have densified, there's kind of granny flats and secondary dwellings. But because in West End, those blocks are very small, like some of them are only 250, 300 square metres, there's not much space to put anything else there. Queensland, in 1885, we introduced the Undue Subdivision of Land Prevention Act. Anything from 1885 onwards, the blocks had to be 405 square metres. That's why Brisbane and our surrounding areas don't have the row houses and townhouses that they have in inner city Sydney and Melbourne. They were illegal. You couldn't build them here. So that's kind of why we have our tin and timber Queenslanders, but it's also why we have sprawl. We've kept this minimum lot size over time. So in West End, we have these small lots and it's quite dense. This block is actually denser than the block in Upper Mount Gravatt in terms of dwelling density. There's more dwellings in that space than there is in Upper Mount Gravatt, even though Upper Mount Gravatt's got some quite high 8-storey apartment buildings. Maruka and West End, none of those houses had garages because there was no cars when they were built. So all the garages have been added on. Some of them look okay, some of them look very strange when you have these huge garages that are kind of shroud the house is hidden behind the garage. When I'm walking the street, you can see the sympathetic garages versus the unsympathetic ones. Whereas by the time you get to Upper Mount Gravatt, built in the 1960s and 1970s, those houses are designed around car storage. The garage is the most prominent part of the house. And I think that's a kind of question we need to ask when we're designing these houses. Is this house actually designed for you as a person who lives there, or is it designed to store your car? Because cars take up a lot of space.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you know know anything about the West Caboolture withdrawal. So that was going to go ahead, and AV Jennings just pulled out. And I wondered whether you would like to make any comment about that.
I can start talking about Caboolture. We kind of forget our history. Ray Kirchhoff is an academic at the University of Southern Queensland. He's done a brilliant book, and it's about Aboriginal campsites and pathways across southeast Queensland. I created a lot of maps. They're on my LinkedIn or they're on my research pages. They call it urban morphology. So urban morphology is kind of the study of the city as human habitat. Urban morphology is looking at the city, streets and layouts and houses and land use. So it's a way of comparing different cities. Cities are actually quite difficult to compare because we have very different histories, which is why some of the things that governments do overseas won't work here, because the way our cities are laid out, the way our politics work, it's very different. Urban morphology is that intersection between maps and history. I realised that a lot of the roads where I live, so Annerley Road, Logan Road, were all originally pathways used by Yagara and Turrbal people before colonisation. And even the siting of Brisbane. So when John Oxley came and did his survey of the Brisbane River, he actually suggested 2 sites for the settlement of the penal colony in what is currently known as Brisbane. And one was at Breakfast Creek and the other one was in Toowoll. Neither of those were followed, obviously, because we've got the central city where it is. There was nothing written down to explain why those colonisers had made the decision to settle where they did. There is oral history from First Nations people, as well as backed by independent research, which shows that that original settlement in central Brisbane was chosen because there was no permanent settlement there by First Nations people. It was used for seasonal food gathering, but it was a place where colonisers could come that was easily defended. We don't talk about this when we talk about the history of the settlement of Brisbane. Obviously, initially, Brisbane, the penal settlement was in Moreton Bay, near, I think, Redcliffe, but it was moved in 1825 to its current site. These kind of decisions really influence the way our city grows and changes over time. So when they were opening what is now Queensland, but at the time it was obviously an extension of New South Wales, for a free settlement in 1842, they sent some surveyors up to do a plan for the town. And they did a plan and they had all these reserves and parklands and streets of a certain width. And then when Governor George Gipps came up, he said, no, we're not spending any more money on this site. It's an inconsequential settlement. It's never going to be anything. We're definitely not having any parks, riverfront places. It's a waste of money and time. Fast forward, and obviously Southeast Queensland is, I think it is the fastest growing area of Australia. So in terms of Caboolture, the first kind of settlement didn't really happen until the 1860s. So you're talking 20 years after the first free settlers were legally allowed to arrive. And we know that colonisers did arrive before that, and land was stolen or granted, but generally people just came and started squatting. In the 1860s, it was for timber, and then there was gold found in Gympie. So you have these rushes of people, but it is quite sparsely populated. We had the railway line extend up to Gympie in the late 1800s, which you get settlement along these railway lines around Moorooka. That was actually a tram suburb. That interwar period, the tram extended to Moorooka and then enabled that suburban development. The intersection between transport technology and the way that our homes are built is really important. And you can really tell by the neighbourhood that you're in about what transport technology your suburb was built around. West End was built around walking and horses and carriages. Moorooka, trams. Upper Mount Gravatt, Caboolture, cars. Obviously, you have patches of town around the railway line. Often these areas have been retrofitted for the car as well. What was originally there is no longer there anymore. So when we talk about Caboolture West, which is a new growth area announced by the Queensland government some years ago, I think, again, we talked about property markets and how housing occurs. You've got big developers that are used to building one product, and that product, and I say product because that's what it is. It's something that's to make money. This isn't about homes. This is about product to be sold. And they're used to producing one type, which is a house on a block. Back in the day, you could have houses that were quite sympathetic to the area that they are built in, whereas today, all of the areas are kind of leveled with a standard block size that's flat on a concrete slab. It's still quite time consuming to build. Like, these are not prefabricated in the way that we think of kit homes. These are built individually, which the Queensland government is definitely looking at new methods of construction to speed up this process. So in terms of Caboolture West, at the moment, the priority is facilitating supply, because we have families living in shanty towns across our cities. I think it's an indictment on our society, and it's an indictment on failed policies over the last 50 30, 70 years. You can pinpoint any time period you like. The emphasis on supply in a driven market means that sometimes developers just cannot make a profit, so they're not going to be building on those sites. It's just as simple as that, which is why that government intervention is really important.
I want to go back a little bit, and you were talking about trains and how they can't make a profit. And I hear this a lot about bus services and trains, and I want to know whether roads for cars, whether that makes a profit.
Well, definitely not. I think the difference is the cost of a car is not captured by the cost of the car. So if the cost of providing the infrastructure for cars, so the roads, was fully captured in the cost of driving, so if you paid for that road every time you use it, it was a pay-to-use system, using a car would not be affordable. It's the same as suburban sprawl. When you are buying a house 40, 50 kilometres away from the central city or from where you work, then the cost of that house included all of the new utilities that need to be put in, so sewage, water, so the utilities you can't see as well as the utilities you can see, the services you can see, so the roads, even the schools, servicing those settlements, and then also the maintenance of those services. Those houses would no longer be affordable. But the reason why we call it greenfield, so greenfield development is when it is a green field. It's not always green, it's farmland or vegetated with trees. That's why greenfield is affordable, inverted commas. Nothing is affordable at the moment, but it is more affordable than building in established suburbs because the cost of that house is heavily subsidized by government, providing all of that wraparound infrastructure that makes that possible. On the flip side, you look at infill development, it can be quite expensive because you're working with very narrow lots and you're not just working in an open field, you're working around existing houses or apartments and old infrastructure. Brisbane's a really perfect example of the cost of sprawl. You know, we only could build houses from 1885 onwards, and it was enabled by transport technology, so initially the tram and then the uptake of the private car. But that's why Brisbane was one of the last cities in Australia. It was the last major city to have reticulated sewerage. So anyone that's grown up around here, middle-aged, I suppose, you would remember that there was dunnies and outhouses in most houses in Brisbane in the 1960s up to the 1970s. It's because it was too expensive to connect them to the mains. We forget that.
I wondered whether the zoning laws that happened and the increasing firmness of that zoning, so it started off as what do we exclude, and then it's like, well, what do you include? It became more and more fragmented because the roads were used by everybody. 100 years ago, everybody was walking, everybody on the street, and you had shops. There was a lot of people just hanging out in the street, socializing. That's where kids used to play. And I wondered if we have internalized zoning, that we have this idea that the road is only for people in cars because it has been zoned. And we're so used to this idea where you have shops here, schools there, transport here, house there. We have Stockholm syndrome of zoning or something. What do you feel about that?
I think that sometimes planners will accept these tools like it's always been. Oh, this is just the tool we use. Zoning's just the tool we use. And we separate them and then we put very large road networks in between them and force people to use cars to get from one place to another. We kind of accept that it's always been like that, but that's not true. Our cities have only been like that for the last 50 to 100 years, which is a very small snapshot in terms of human society, but it's actually quite a large snapshot of colonial settlement in Queensland. Unfortunately for us, most of our growth has occurred in this car period. And once you bake in these land use patterns, once you bake them into your city, it is very, very difficult and very expensive to undo them. So governments don't. Once you lay out those parcels, say, this is your property, this is my property, this is where the street is, this is where the road reserve is, this is where the footpath is, this is where the school is. It's very hard to undo or unpick those things without government intervention. But our governments do intervene all the time. It just depends what for. I think that there's a broader question here about, governments have quite extraordinary powers when it comes to redevelopment and acquisition of land. Just go down to Wollongabba and see the huge infrastructure that's occurring as part of the Cross Rural development. And obviously then there's the debate around the stadium there at the Gabba. But the government has enormous power in that regard. But certain things, particularly the provision of housing, we've left that to the private market, not just the way that we zone, but the way that it's built. And in other countries, so if you go overseas, they have what are called plan-led systems. So the government will design the plan and say, this is what buildings should look like, this is what streets should look like, and basically developers are just appointed to build the government's vision, by extension, the people's vision in democratically elected government. Whereas here we have a very development-led system. So the the developer comes to government, the planning scheme is a guide as to what the government foresees in that area, what it would like, but it is up to the developer to come and introduce their proposal and seek approval. Gone are the days where government planners would sit there designing communities and designing best practice. You have a lot of really good planners that sit there, and there's a model neighbourhood design code for new developments in Queensland that requires street trees and footpaths for new developments. So you've got all these planners doing really great work, but they're not the ones leading it because we have this development-led system that is really up to the proponent. And in a market as tight as we have now, it is very difficult even for developers to make money. I think there's people that will disagree. It's only evidenced by the developers withdrawing from projects. If there was money to be made, they would be there. Developers are often one of the most transparent people in this process because they are there to make money. Their motivations are not hidden. I was in Melbourne for the Planning Congress, which is a conference for planners across Australia, and a video was shown, educational video that was shown in the 1930s of educating people of the dangers of the car. So the car was being introduced, and it was these videos of elderly women chatting on the street, children sitting on the road with chalk or playing, a man reading his newspaper as he's walking down the street, not looking, just reading the newspaper. Basically, the premise of the video was kind of like, get off the road, you don't belong here anymore. But that time period of the 1930s to today, that's someone's lifetime. The function of our streets has changed dramatically. Like, I could not even imagine just walking, holding a newspaper on the street outside my house without a care in the world. It's just, you just wouldn't do that today. But I think we forget that the streets weren't always like this. That's not what they were initially designed for. They're actually designed for people to walk.
In Paris, now that they have made it very bicycle friendly, all that is coming back. Paris has become a 15-minute city, or becoming a 15-minute city. What's happening is the kids are out there playing on the streets now, so that's very nice.
I really encourage anyone, if you do get the opportunity to go to these places that aren't designed for cars. So recently, as I said, I was in Melbourne and I went to Brunswick, and there's some not-for-profit developers in Brunswick called Nightingale. I have lots of feelings about those developments, but one of them is the fact that there is no garages. So they do have some very small amounts of car parking to the rear, but to the front of the buildings they don't, which means the streets are essentially a public space because there are no cars needing to go down there. Having a conversation without being interrupted by car traffic is something I think we forget, and especially where I live. I have a relative that lives in a regional community and doesn't have the same amount of, traffic as we do here. He stays with us quite frequently, and he said to me, I don't understand how you can even listen to a podcast when you're walking down these streets because of the traffic noise. You have to have noise-cancelling headphones to be able to listen to your podcast, or you can't have a conversation as you're waiting at the intersection because the car noise is so high. We don't have to live like that. When you grow up and this is all you know, then of course you don't know any different. And I'm somebody that grew up in a suburb, and I was driven to school for most of my primary school, and it's just an accepted norm. It's nobody's fault. It's just the way that it is. When you live in a suburb where that is your safest and most convenient at times transport option, of course you're going to choose that option. We bought a cargo bike when my daughter was 2, and I felt quite negligent actually taking her on that cargo bike because we had to commute into West End, which is terrifying at times. And I found being on the footpath was more dangerous than the road because the cars don't look as they back out of their driveway. Whereas if you're on the road, they do look at the road because obviously they don't want to hit another car. It was more safe being on the road in the painted cycle lane than it was being on the footpath. I started cycling into West End from another southern suburb in 2016, and I was doing it up until 2022. Things changed over that period. Another school went on that road, and I think also attitudes started to change. I think the cycling community got bigger. Cargo bikes, electric bikes became a more widely adopted form of transport. And I noticed over that 6-year period feeling very exposed at the beginning and very unsafe to cars actually taking a lot more care on that same stretch of road with very limited infrastructure improvements. There was some improvements outside of the new public high school, but the rest of the road is still exactly the same. I think as more people adopt different forms of transport, the attitude does change. And I look at my children and they don't know any different besides like cycling or walking to school.
So here we are in Caboolture. People have cars, they're dependent on cars. What suggestions do you have for people to be able to to just shift away from cars or use alternative transport, or in relation to your own planning laws, what do you suggest that our listener who isn't a planner, who isn't in the system, can make our space a little bit friendlier, nicer, more livable? What do you suggest that people can do on their own without having to ask for permission?
I would reclaim your spaces. I think that things like street libraries, I have a friend who used to live in Zilmere and she's moved further out just because she likes gardening and likes to have a bigger space, but she's always set up a street library and a community exchange program just in the front of her house. And she has a house with no footpath, but people are there all the time because it's a community destination, and you can create these spaces for yourself. You don't have to wait for a local government official to come and do it for you. You don't need to wait for a specific program. Somewhere along the lines, we've lost our agency. I think we need to reclaim your agency. If you see something that's annoying you, there's nothing like in terms of your community. I think there was a podcast earlier about loneliness. This is something that we can all do together. Those street libraries, a box of books at the front of your house, or if you do have a veggie garden and having an exchange program, they're just kind of little things that you could do to say, there's people here and there's people that are engaged. And I think the more people that engage with each other, the more likely that our ideas are going to be heard and implemented. Even schools, for example. If you're a family and you've got young kids at school, my local primary school, it's not particularly safe for kids to cycle, just a lot of main roads. So we have set up an active travel committee. We did a survey. You can use programs like Qualtrics for free. I'm actually thinking about putting a kit together, but it's things like looking at the barriers that parents have had, and a lot of them are big infrastructure barriers, main roads, dangerous rail crossings. They're not things that I can fix, but they are things that if we identify them in a survey and we send them to our local member, that they can advocate for us. And it's not a quick fix, but people that have got these objective evidence, we had over 200 parents complete our survey, which is quite big. When people are busy, it's a 10-minute survey and required people to fill out their barriers, why they choose the option that they do. And mostly people chose cars because it was convenient and safe. If we can make it safer, even just by bulk of numbers, it's a positive step.
When you've got that ready, I'll put something on my website. Is there anything else that you would like to add to what you've already said? Any other ideas, any other thoughts you have about anything at all?
I guess other thoughts, and just in terms of Caboolture, I think, and Morayfield specifically, there are really good bones in that community. When I talk about bones, I mean like the layout, the railway line, there are really good bones. And I think Moreton Bay Regional Council, I would just encourage people to engage with them into designing the community that they want to see. It's not good enough that you go down, Gympie Road or these places and they're just kind of car-centric, big shopping centres. Like, it could be so much better. There's no reason why it can't be, but it needs a kind of engaged community. And you don't need to be a planner. You don't need to be a traffic engineer. You just need to be someone who wants something better. And the bones are there. So...
yeah, and I don't know anything about public transport or active transport or human scale transport or planning or community groups, and I started. And I know that what I do makes a difference in the community. It's always good to make a bit of noise, not to be mean or nasty, buttonholing politicians or anything like that. It is the squeaky wheel that gets the most attention, for sure. I have enjoyed so much of this conversation. Thank you very much. I know you are flat chat with many things, winding up your PhD, getting papers published, young family, plus. So I very much appreciate you taking this time out to be on the show. I'm very honoured. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E, there's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.